Thank you for joining the Powers Company webinar. We'll be starting at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, so please stand by. Thank you for joining us. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining. This is the Powers Company webinar, and we will be starting in just a few minutes. Just wanted to let you know that we're glad that you're here. We look forward to having a great session with you here in just a few minutes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Powers webinar. This is actually a three-part series. This is the first part. It's a webinar based on panic is not a strategy. What we'll be talking about throughout the course of the series is how to maximize your business productivity and efficiency and reducing costs. So today I want to introduce myself. I'm CEO of the Powers Company, Sean Hart, and sitting next to me is Dante Vaughn, our Vice President of Leadership and Organizational Development. And what we want to do is we want to start to bring you into a series of, again, panic is not a strategy, and what can we do effectively inside of our organization today during the Corona era virus to make sure we maximize our productivity, our output, and still keep our cost constraints. So I want to turn it over to Dante, and why don't you tell us a little bit about the learning objectives that we're going to go through today.
Sure, thank you, Sean. I want to start by just thanking everyone for tuning into our webinar. And what you'll notice about Sean and I is we we want to facilitate this webinar in a way that encourages you to ask questions. Don't be afraid to use the chat features within the webinar. If you have any questions, cut us off. We sometimes get really excited about the topics that we're talking about. We just want to be as open and candid about how to reduce those costs quickly and efficiently within your organization. And that really begins with discussing how to identify and leverage skills flexibility within the organization. What does skills flexibility really mean, and how does that relate to reducing costs? So we'll talk a bit about that. Then we're going to get into some steps to increase capacity within your organization without necessarily having to increase headcount, especially during this time where controlling costs are going to be really imperative to an organization. And then we'll get into some discussions around how to identify and eliminate what we call non-value-added activities or functions within your process. And finally, we'll close out with some best practices and tips on how to avoid or minimize waste within the organization. Sound good? Excellent. Awesome. Now we have part of our team, they're going to be signaling us when you have any questions. So we'll be sure to pause and reflect on those questions accordingly. So let's get started. You know, we talk about this skills flexibility as a means to reduce costs. Skills flexibility, what does that really mean for the legislative point?
Yeah, so when I think about skills flexibility, really what I'm thinking about is, you know, how do we use our current staff, especially in the Corona era? How do we start to take the current staff that we have now, and how do we start to leverage those skills and build on top of those skills? So if I'm an operator on the floor, you know, I may be on my traditional work week solidified to one area or one asset of a piece of equipment, right? Now I have the actual opportunity to start to increase my skills, and I may not only get my skills on that particular area or asset, but now maybe I can move into a quality role and start to understand skills I need to develop there. Maybe I move into a forklift role if I need to do there. If I'm in something outside of manufacturing, say I'm in an insurance company and I'm working in claims, right? Maybe I have to start bridging over and start understanding what underwriting really does, you know, and how do the processes start to connect with each other? And how do I start to build the skills of my organization that with reduced staffing due to absenteeism and turnover, how are we actually going to start to use the crew that we have inside to meet our productivity goals that we need on a daily basis?
Okay, so from what I'm hearing, you know, when we talk about increased skills flexibility, it's impacting costs related to employee turnover, the talent staffing or acquisition that's occurring within your practice, and some discussions around productivity in terms of how we're leveraging those skills in other areas of the business. And then, of course, this notion of execution and around action plans to variances. So I want to explore that because, you know, at the end of the day, during this time, there are critical decisions that need to be made in an instant. And the theme around this webinar series is how do we avoid this notion of panic and be more strategic about how we're leveraging our employees within the operation. So from a skills flexibility standpoint, well, we have a question.
Oh.
Okay, we'll pause on that question because I want to talk about skills flexibility as it relates to hiring from within.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great topic because I think what you're going to see now is that you used to use the word back in, you know, in the older days of tribal knowledge.
Yes.
Okay. And I think what you're going to see now is that you've got to not only have those people who have that tribal knowledge, but how are you going to start to bring the new folks up in a system and processes that will allow them to be effective, right? And so when you start to talk about skills flexibility and you start to talk about management operating systems, it's about how do we start to take the current staffing and crewing we have now and start to build them up. So as we get out of the virus era, you know, that we're actually going to have a solidified team who are going to be able to effectively manage our business. And as a frontline supervisor, I should be able to know how am I going to effectively manage my operators with pulling out the lost waste that is happening inside my department. Okay, so you're really looking for how do I start to build this organizational culture up and how am I going to take that and move it and advance it? And so as we come out of the virus, how am I going to bring the new folks in with the right processes and the right systems so we can make sure that we're the most effective throughout the course of our days?
And from what I'm hearing, then, the more visibility we have to skills or competencies of our team members, the better we're able to backfill positions where we have shortages or attrition during this time as well. So I'm avoiding some of those external costs for hiring and this revolving door scenario that some organizations are facing.
Absolutely. It gives you the opportunity to really, what the true opportunity for what you really need from a staffing perspective out on the lines. Number two, what it allows you to do is to understand your high risk areas and how do you start to formulate teams around and give them the skills that they need to be so you can start to move people through the organization to tackle productivity numbers that they may need. So if you have 3 different areas that need to be run in one day, how are you actually going to move your crewing throughout the organization to make sure that you can still meet the demands, especially if you're in food and beverage right now. Food and beverage, there are high demands on it. I've talked to some of our clients, you know, they've got some areas that are on a demand standpoint are up 160%, you know, especially in specific trade pack areas.
Sure.
That way they can get them out to the market. So right now what you have to do is you have to start to move those people around and start to understand what are the true skill sets of the people I have showing up every day, and how can I bring those folks together to make sure I can maximize the output and meet my needs.
Makes sense, Sean. Makes sense. You know, we really encourage you to reflect on that skills flexibility within your team, you know, particularly because it serves as an opportunity from a hiring standpoint as well. By understanding where you have gaps in skills or competencies, you're better able to tailor your hiring targets, your initiatives around talent acquisition to identify candidates who fill the void in terms of competencies that you need within your business. So that enables you to be more strategic with staff placement once you've been able to hire those employees on. Do you see any other opportunities where skills flexibility equips organizations to better appoint staff within the operation or to be able to foster more motivation with the staff?
Yeah, I think when you start talking, that's a great question, because when you start talking about on the cultural piece, when you start talking about how do you motivate employees, right? I mean, there's 2 things employees, when they come on board, they want to know. They want to know, what do I have to do to be successful here? Sure. Right? And what's that criteria in which I have to follow? Sure. Okay. And so when you have that 2 criteria mapped out, we have to understand if I'm coming in as an operator level, if I'm coming in as a supervisory level, what is going to allow me to get promoted and be successful and move out through the organization? You get turnover and attrition because people don't understand the value that they're bringing to the organization, and they don't understand where their true path is as they move through the organization. So when you start to talk about skills flexibility, it really gives you the opportunity, not at only the operator level, at the supervisory level, the manager level, on how we're going to move people through a track which is going to allow them to reach their optimal talent, right? Some people are just meant to be supervisors, some people are meant to be managers, some people are meant to be vice presidents, and so on and so forth. So how do we start to gear and track those folks onto the path on where they need to be, so we can make sure that they end up in the right home and that they're going to have the highest level of success? Only then will we be able to make sure that we sustain the people that we have, right? And they're not going to go look for another job somewhere else. They're not going to have, they're not going to relate to our turnover or attrition, and they've actually got a clear path on how to be successful. So when I think about when you start talking about how do you motivate and boost morale, well, you want to boost morale, tell people how to be successful inside your business. Absolutely. And then let them have the opportunity to do that. But you got to give them the skills to do that. So that means you can't pigeonhole them in one particular spot. You have to move them throughout the entire organization and increase their knowledge. And once you increase people's knowledge and their skills, they're more likely to stay in your organization because they provide value. And when people see that they're value added and they can provide value, they want to keep moving with it.
Okay, absolutely. You know, when we think about a desire to want to progress or grow within an organization, it's not always through the lens of promotion from one position to another. That visibility that's created with skills flexibility and specific planning and that track that you're referring to, that employee will feel a sense of contribution and growth over a period of time, which is exactly what you want to foster, especially during this time of uncertainty. That makes sense. I want to pause if we have any questions. If not, we'll proceed, because now that we talked about a bit about how to leverage skills flexibility among our teams, I want to talk about now, right? So we understand where contribution can be applied across our production operation. How do I increase capacity, or in what we refer to as capacity utilization, without necessarily adding headcount? Because now I have capacity with my internal team based on my visibility of skills flex. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you start to branch away from skills flexibility, now that we've brought our teams together and you've been able to bring your teams together and you understand how you're going to move them throughout the production facility or throughout your organization to get the optimal results, that's one piece of it, making sure we have the right people, the right skills. The second piece is actually getting the productivity and capacity utilization that you want, right? And that's going to be based off of your demand, the run hours that you need. We have many clients right now who are running 24/7, just trying to put out whatever they can. So when you start to talk about how you're going to start leveraging those capacities and how you're going to bring in that skills flexibility, it's about understanding what is the true capacity of my bottleneck. So you have to remember, some of these folks have probably never worked in that area before. So we have to educate them and bring them together on what is the true capacity of the line, what are the skills needed for that line, and start working with them. Now, as you get into the Corona era, right, we have this thing we are supposed to be 6 feet apart from each other. So it gets a little bit harder to group people into a huddle and manually show them the skills that they need. But even with the 6 feet, it doesn't stop us as a frontline supervisor or a manager of our area to go out there and communicate with the folks and say, hey, when we're talking about capacity, what's your plan for the day? Now that we know plan, what are we actually doing, and what are the variances that they're actually seeing out on the floor? We can still have that dialogue,
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
What we can't have that dialogue is very close together like we used to. But we can still understand variances, and we can still work with our teams to remove bottlenecks and optimize capacity utilization. Okay? You're also going to see other pieces where you have non-value versus value-added activities, right? I mean, what is preventing us from being successful on a daily basis or an hourly basis or a short-term basis based on our product mix, but also what is going to attribute now that we don't have the labor that we used to have, and we were already strong before we even moved into the Corona era, coronavirus era.
Sure.
We were already having a problem being able to find talent and labor to bring into our organization in the first place, right? So now that we have those two constraints working against us, it's now more than ever that our frontline supervisors first have to be involved with the safety of our employees, right? And making sure that we don't spread any of the virus or that we are meeting all the protocols that our organizations laid out for us. But now we have the second piece on how we actually meet those productivity goals, okay? And so it's now imperative for the frontline supervisor to be walking through their lines at the distance and communicating with their folks at even a higher engagement rate than they were before, trying to understand variances and barriers that are occurring.
So when we talk about eliminating or containing bottlenecks, as a supervisor, there are some quick steps that you can take in order to identify where those bottlenecks may exist. Now, we're going to talk a bit about forms of waste, because typically where there are non-value added activities, they're attributed to waste. But even prior to evaluation of those scenarios, as a supervisor, there are indicators or leading indicators that suggest I have some bottlenecks, and that's more obvious, right? Delays in production, right? That would suggest you have a bottleneck. But sometimes there are subtleties. If you look at your material usage and you have overstock of specific supplies that really shouldn't exist, that may suggest that you have a bottleneck in a specific portion of your operation. You may find that I see an increase in this time of customer complaints around a specific product, right? That may suggest I have some issues with bottlenecks in that process, even down to high turnover or attrition in areas that are a little less common to see that type of revolving door may suggest that you have a bottleneck issue that you may want to get in front of in order to increase capacity, especially during this time right now.
Yeah. So I think when you really think about it that way, it's first you have to bring the people together to understand where the bottlenecks are,
Sure.
what the true demand is. So what you're really going to start seeing is how do we take 5 people, right, on a line that used to require 7 people?
Sure.
How are we going to take those same 5 people and get the same productivity levels out? Because that will help with the cost constraint, right? When I'm trying to be more effective on my costs right now inside my business.
Sure.
And what you're going to start finding out is people are going to start acknowledging processes that were embedded inside of the asset or the line or whatever piece of equipment they're working on. They're going to start to notice all the lost time and waste steps that were occurring. So right now, as we go out to the floor, when we say we shouldn't be in panic mode, what we should really be in is value added mode, which is what are the steps that we've been able to eliminate and still yet hit productivity goals?
Absolutely.
And what did we remove out of the process? As long as we're still meeting first pass quality product out the door, what were we able to eliminate? And so when we start to ramp back up and the business starts to come back up to a place where it needs to be and it starts to normalize over time, that we're going to be able to say, hey, we're not going to embed those bad processes that we put in place. Okay, we're going to keep those processes out. We're going to continue to run like this with the right labor, with the right materials, with the right methods and processes, so we can make sure that we have the good output that we want.
When I hear you talk about non-value added activities, an easy way to sort of begin to assess what's value add versus non-value add is to ask yourself, how will the functions or activities being performed by my team help me deliver my product to my customer? And if you can't answer that with some level of clarity around why they're doing what they're doing, then it may fall into the category of non-value added. Right? So that's an easy way to begin to make the connection between, well, I think everything they're doing is value added, not necessarily if it doesn't contribute to your desired outcome or output, right?
Yeah.
So there's some categories or ways to look at value added versus non-value added. Typically, value added relates to any processes that connect to your fulfillment of your orders, for example. And that includes proactive activities. So aligning my raw materials, ordering my materials, ensuring that they're in stock. All those things will be considered value added. It doesn't suggest that waste doesn't exist within there, but generally speaking, that would be value added versus some activities that don't necessarily contribute to my fulfillment or my objective. So oftentimes, excessive administrative tasks would be considered non-value added. Any waiting, right? If we see standing on the line as a result of steps that are being taken, typically that will be considered non-value added, right?
Absolutely. And I think, that's a good piece. And I think, you have 2 pieces of business and how you try to manage it. You have 1, the technical piece, and 2, you have the tactical piece, right? So many people will understand the technical terms of, okay, reduce lost time and waste. How do I increase capacity utilization, skills flexibility? I think one of the biggest attributes that you have to have on top of that, though, is how do you still maintain the behavior? So
Absolutely.
that's really a question I'm going to ask for you to respond to is, how do you maintain the right supervisory and management behaviors through a process that requires, it almost forces you to almost take a panic mentality out of it, right? And how do you create the same behaviors and keep pushing and motivating organizations through so when they come outside of the era, they're still on top?
Great question. One of the things that we look at, and everything that we're talking about requires situational awareness. Right? I have to understand what's going on around me functionally, but also with my team. By understanding and identifying the behaviors around what my teams are doing, how they're executing, I will begin to identify where there may be issues or bottlenecks that are occurring in short interval. So having that situational awareness is an important behavior. Another one is from a communication standpoint. I have to be engaged and communicate. To your point, while adhering to social distancing protocols, I want to be engaged in frequency with my team to understand that they are clear around their expectations and those performance objectives, and that they feel a sense of encouragement or empowerment to communicate back to me when they encounter challenges or issues. To your point, while we may have a desire to have an awareness of what's going on, it's their input, it's their feedback, and the visibility that they give us, 'cause they're on the line minute for minute. So the more we have visibility to that, the better. So you have to foster that communication between the supervisor and the employee. So you have situational awareness, you have this ability to foster communication and encourage that reciprocal dialogue between you and your employees on the line. And then the other piece is being solution oriented. I think in a time when we are oftentimes feeling anxiety and a sense of panic around the changes that are happening around us, we want to be sure to take a deep breath and reflect on, okay, how do I identify this through the lens of a solution, not just treat it as a problem and a barrier that I can't get over. That gets into this notion of, I had a plan, there's a variance as a result of where I want it to be, what actions am I going to take? That requires a solution-oriented mindset. So I think those are where you start to see the leadership behaviors really make the technical pieces of what we're talking about optimal in terms of outcomes.
And when you start to talk about that, I mean, that obviously would affect the entire culture of the organization, right? I mean, so it really comes down from the top leader and how they're managing it and how they're dealing with the particular situation that they're in, right? So if it's coronavirus, how they actually deal with that particular situation, and how they communicate down to their leaders.
Sure.
So if I'm trying to maintain the culture, what are some initiatives that I could take to do that?
You know, I think maintaining a culture really speaks to, first, an understanding of how are my actions and behaviors influencing results and the people around me. You know, and that requires a measure of not only awareness but empathy, a true desire to want to understand how people are responding to what's going on in our environment with all of these changes, and a willingness to accept that how my actions are influencing my team, both in how they're performing, how they're feeling motivated or inspired to perform at whatever level that we want to have. So I think that's an important piece. And in addition to that, I believe it's important for a heightened sense of and desire to align with a leadership mindset. The leadership mindset is going to be important because people are looking for others to have some direction, some vision, some answer to what's going on right now. Because there's so much uncertainty around what is this going to mean for my job? What is it going to mean for my future? Is my business stable? Is my position stable? So it's going to be important from top down to articulate in the midst of what's going on. We are okay. We're going to get through this, and the decisions that we're making are for the benefit of you now, but for the organization at large into the future as well. So I think that's where you begin to start to foster the culture that you need, especially during this time.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, when you start talking about how you go about reducing costs, it's not always a technical solution, right? I mean, the reason we call them technical and tactical is because once you overlay the culture over it, it's about how do you go about attacking not only the technical variances that are happening inside the organization, but how are you going to do that from a tactical basis and make sure that those behaviors that you want to instill in your people continue to translate out onto the floor. Because not only are you going to do two things, you're going to help those supervisors grow or those managers grow that are underneath you. And the next time a problem occurs, right, they're going to have learned from you and demonstrate the same behaviors you've demonstrated on how to effectively get through a crisis situation. Number two, they're also going to understand, how do I do that and still continue to keep up with the demands that are being put on to the business as well to keep us up and going.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. So we talked about identifying skills flexibility. We reflected on having that awareness of where the skills and competencies exist within my team and how to strategically leverage those skills across the organization, right? Minimizing the need to go externally, addressing backfill opportunities, shortages in certain areas. We reflected on then how to leverage that by way of increasing capacity in the operation. And we said, by understanding that, now I want to start to address bottlenecks, right? I have the skills, I have the resources internally I've leveraged. I'm starting to maximize capacity opportunities. Now I want to minimize or rid of those bottlenecks that are holding me up, right? And we did that in the context of both tactical and technical. We want to open that up now to our attendees within the webinar. Do you have any questions around some of the topics that we talked about? You know, can you reflect on any panic modes that you feel yourself in or your organization in relative to what's going on now? We're open to questions, and we want to share in some dialogue. So we'll pause for a moment, and any other thoughts as we...
Well, I think as you start to talk about the skills flexibility piece and going out and understanding lost time and waste, it's also very imperative that you use the resources that you have in the organization, which is how do we start to take our human resources folks and pull them in and start to have them help us develop training plans for our folks? Because remember, the people who are showing up today are the people who are going to show up tomorrow. Okay, so especially during a crisis situation, you're really finding out who's on your team and who's not. I mean, so the people who have abandoned you and that's hunkered down in the trenches with you, right? So those are the folks you really want to start understanding. Okay, as we come out of this, where do we start to slot them in? Where do they start to develop? So it sounds like we've got a question right now.
Yeah, Jimmy McAllister asked, my department has unnecessary rework and packaging materials waste at times. What do you think is the best approach to bring more visibility to this problem?
Excellent. You mind if I take that?
Sure.
I love it. That's a great question, and especially for an operational question. So if you've got some excess rework and waste happening in your area, especially packaging materials, the first thing I'm always going to tell you is what gets measured gets done. Okay, so we want to make sure we have a measurement to our area. So if I don't know what your particular situation is, but if I have a particular unit that I see that is creating rework in my area, I want to start to first understand how much of that rework is occurring, okay? Second of all, now I want to start get to the root cause of my problem, okay? So I want to really go out there and monitor the line. So I have my observations on what's happening on the line. Two, I want to bring the people engaged in that area so they can start observing what's happening on the line, so we can start to really root cause and diagnose where our rework is coming from. Now, you may find that rework's coming from upstream. It may be coming from inputs coming to you from another area. So it's not something that's just going to be highly visible to you. You're going to have to do some digging and some research and get your team together to really understand what is causing the variances. The reason it's important to measure it, because as you start to find out those variances and you start to eliminate them, your measurement should start to show you an improvement in your area. If it hasn't shown you an improvement, you may have found a small piece of lost waste, but that's not really the critical piece that's stopping you from hitting your numbers on a daily basis. Okay? When you start talking about packaging waste, this is always one that I really like, because packaging waste can go sometimes blinded by the night that we just see it as plastic, or we just see it as styrofoam or boxes, right? And those get thrown away. What we don't really understand is what the true cost of those packaging materials are. In some organizations, you can even find out that packaging materials they cost more than even the labor cost of the entire business. So when you really start talking about packaging, I say reuse the same method. Start to create a measurement on your packaging materials. Start to identify the variances that are causing your packaging material numbers not to be where you want them at, and then start reducing costs. I can tell you almost in any organization, if you start to find packaging waste and you start eliminating that, you're going to be a rock star.
Great. And Sean, just to add to that point, it's important that you always assume a mindset that it's typically when you have those type of challenges, they're process-centric more than they're people-centric. Typically, if you look to address the problem as the process and not the person, you're going to realize a better outcome, and you'll be able to get those individuals involved in the process more aligned to whatever you're trying to implement as an action to resolve that issue, whether it's waste or rework or what have you. So be sure as you approach and you begin to investigate and root cause, analyze the issue, that you address the process and not the people as the problem from a cultural standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the people are out there on the front lines every day with you every hour. And I think when you have that, you're really trying to get those folks involved. So you want to look at them. I always tell frontline supervisors, you want to get down to the root cause of your problems. Don't go out there looking for what the people are doing wrong. A, look for what they're doing right. B, now get side by side with them. And if you have your measurement that you've written out, and if Dante was my operator on the floor, I'm going to talk to him side by side and go, hey, look at this measurement right here. We're not getting the numbers that we want. What do you think we should do about it? Exactly. Right? And have it this way. When you start to talk to people in this direction, people take that very personal. So when I hold it up and I go, Dante, you know, we were supposed to hit 10, we only hit 5. You know, now I've made it a very personal conversation, and I'm coming after the person instead of this in this manner where I'm attacking the process and we're going to work together.
Yeah. So great question, Jimmy.
Yeah,
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, Matthew comments, he says, one thing that I've learned during this is that I have to be comfortable being in charge, but not always in control. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts, advice on how to cope with this on a daily basis?
That is a great question, Matthew. If I could start.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sean, I think part of your ability to manage or cope with that transition, and it sounds to me that you're in a senior leadership position or someone who initially had oversight on areas that are no longer the scope of your responsibility. I think first you have to have a clear distinction between what you're accountable for versus what you're responsible for. So oftentimes when we talk about this context of control, we mean it in the form of ownership and accountability, right? And as you make a transition from a frontline leadership role to more of a senior leadership role, the scope of what you own and are accountable to becomes broader. But oftentimes those specific tasks or those areas that you're responsible for making decisions around or executing on no longer rest with you. They rest with another leader or level within your organization. Be very clear about that distinction. And then once you have that clarity, then you can begin to then shift focus around ownership and accountability to the other leaders within your organization. And it's something you have to practice every day. And part of that becomes being really transparent with those subordinate leaders and speaking to them and say, hey guys, I'm working on this. And it's a struggle for me, but I need your help in triggering or letting me know when I am overstepping in a realm that I've asked you to own and be accountable for. I encourage you to check out our Power Your Culture series on YouTube, because we talk about how to foster ownership and accountability among our supervisory group. And the way to do that is definitely for you to create that line of distinction and separation. And you have to give them or empower them with that decision-making authority. Not everything that we own, we necessarily make all the decisions around. So keep that in mind. But thank you for asking, Matthew.
I think it was a great question because, you know, I always think about the senior level leaders, and then I also think of, it takes me all the way down to the frontline supervisors, right?
Yeah.
And as I'm a frontline supervisor, I mean, the reason I was hired is to make decisions,
Yes.
right? And when my decisions started getting made for me, my natural reaction is to go back to that senior leader and say, hey, here's my problem. Please solve it for me, right? Instead of me actually as a frontline supervisor having the ownership and accountability of that area and of that problem, right? Yeah. So I agree with you. I mean, you have to make that distinction on what you own and what you don't own. So as a senior level, you know, your job is to be the maestro of the orchestra, right? You're supposed to be pulling everybody and creating, giving them A, the resources they need to be successful, but B, carving out the path
Sure.
so they can be successful and they can be led and guided to make the right decisions.
Absolutely.
As the frontline supervisor, it's my job when I come in on board is to make those decisions because all the costs are flowing through me. You know, if I have, you know, back to even Jimmy, right? If I have the packaging costs, I have material costs, I have the labor costs, I have the whip costs, I have everything that is coming through the entire facility is controlled by me and the decisions that I make, right? And so once you take that decision making away from the frontline supervisor, you've now become the owner of the area and you have to make the decisions, right? And so now they just fall in line and go, well, I'm just going to wait for Joe to tell me what to do and I'll go out there and do it.
Yeah.
We have to always ensure that the frontline supervisors understand that they have the right to make decisions out on the floor that are going to help control the outcomes of the business.
Yes, absolutely. Great questions. Keep them coming. That's what we're here for.
So let's go into, as we're waiting for questions, we'll go into, we should talk to them a little bit about Tim Woods.
Okay.
I think Tim Woods is a great thing, especially when you start talking about lost time and waste. Dante does a great job about telling the story of Tim Woods.
You know, we brought up this discussion around non-value-added activities. And most of those non-valued activities and functions are directly attributed to waste within your operation. And when we talk about waste, sometimes it's difficult because there's so many categories of waste. Like, how do I know where waste really occur within my business? An easy way to remember is to think of Tim Woods. And no offense to anyone named Tim Woods, but in this context, Tim Woods really refers to the 8 categories of waste, right? Transportation is the T in Tim Woods. That's moving items or information within my operation. And are those movements necessary, right? Inventory, right? Information or items that our customer has not received, but still exists within my operation. You know, motion, that's excessive movement within the workplace, especially in a production capacity. You know, waiting is the W in Tim Woods. That's waiting for information or items, right, to arrive. And the longer you wait, the more waste exists within that realm of waste. Over processing, that's another area, especially in the midst of this panic mode that many of our clients are in. You know, doing more work than what's necessary is not a way to respond to an increase in demand. It's important that you balance reducing overprocessing and the other O in Tim Woods, overproduction, doing more work before it's needed. So it's a fine line, and that's where your scheduling, planning and scheduling, especially in this time, becomes very critical, especially when our supply chains are disrupted in the manner that they are. Typically, there's waste that exists in that overprocessing, overproduction realm. Defects is the D in Woods. That's really where any mistakes or errors that are driving rework within your operation, that's another area you want to minimize. And then the S in Tim Woods are skills, and that's an important one. Sean alluded to this notion of having visibility to skills flexibility. Once I know I have skills and competencies that enable me to potentially move someone into other areas, silly of me if I don't actually leverage those skills. By the way, you not leveraging those skills in your business in some way, shape, or form is considered a form of waste in your operation. So if you remember Tim Woods, it's an easy way to start to focus your attention on how do I begin to address those areas if I want to increase capacity in my operation. So shout out to Tim Woods.
Yeah, it's a great simple process to be able to know the name and understand, okay, what identifies lost time and waste in my area. You know, and then making sure as a supervisor or a manager or someone that oversees supervisors and managers, making sure that I've got the right behaviors around those to make sure that I'm identifying what is actually causing my lost time and waste. So when we talk about behaviors, you know, it can be, you know, how do we get more proactive supervision? How do we get more short-term interval follow-up with our folks out on the floor? Absolutely. How do we go about getting visual management out on our floors? Okay? Some of those are lean concepts, but some of them are just basic blocking and tackling skills of a frontline supervisor. And when you're in the midst of what you call panic, right, you can't leave those fundamental blocking and tackling skills, because when you do that, you lose productivity, you lose money, and then you lose trust of the organization that we've actually got our hands around it, right? So, you know, some ways that you could think about doing that when you're thinking, okay, well, you know, how do I go about actually understanding where all the waste is being generated from? A good way to do is what we call brown paper exercises in our business, which is get a brown paper out there, lay out the process that you have, get some red stickies, you know, get a black magic marker and start writing down and putting red stickies all over the process flow on where you start to see opportunity at. Get your folks to come in, even with the social distancing right now. I don't have to have everybody come in the room at the same time. I can bring one person at a time in to really start to maximize. Okay, you tell me where the inputs and the outputs come out from my flow. And let's talk about everything in between that doesn't make sense, doesn't have the right process, doesn't have the right measurement. And we're going to start eliminating these one by one. So I call it, you know, you create your as-is process on what does it look like today, all right? So there's lots of opportunity out there to go out there and grab. And then we're going to talk, you're going to define what the to-be process is. And you're going to go out there and all those red stickers or those red areas that you define in your as-is process, which were opportunities, you're just going to start eliminating those one by one, one by one. As you start to eliminate those with your folks out on the floor, you're automatically going to see your productivity numbers increase. So when the demands are the high stress on the business, or with our food and beverage clients that are, you know, they're on the full tilt right now. I mean, right? I mean, any hour that they can operate, they're going to operate and push out product. Well, this is the time now more than ever. You have to really start eliminating those barriers for you to start to get through. And now, as you come back to normal, your frontline supervisors and managers, they get to go, this is the new system. This is the way that we operate.
And so I think from what you're sharing, it's important that when we come out of the dust of what's going on right now, don't lose sight of the improvements that you've been able to make or barriers that you've been able to identify. Even if it wasn't something you could address right away, keep it in mind as part of a future action or initiative that you want to take on post the coronavirus era. If you've identified best practices that have enabled you to increase efficiency, attainment, capacity, why stop?
Yeah.
Why not explore that further? And I think that's what I'm hearing you saying. You know, this is an opportunity. You know, it's one way to look at things. You can look at it as a barrier, things are happening to you, or you can look at it as an opportunity because things are happening because of me. And I think that's an important mindset to have as we look past the coronavirus era and how our businesses are operating.
Yeah. Panic mode will allow you to lose sustainability.
Absolutely.
And that's what you have to be careful about. When you talk about sustainability of processes, whether they're good processes or bad processes,
Sure.
When people get into panic mode and they start to get anxious, right, things, activities start to drop off.
Sure.
Right? And when activities start to drop off, something has to be affected.
Sure.
Okay? Whether that's good or bad, it just depends on what the activities were, right? So when you start thinking about in that scenario, when you're going through a situation like this, you need to ensure that you keep the right processes throughout the organization. So as you come back up, I've said before, as you come back up, those processes are still stable. Because what will happen is those processes will drop off. You'll lose sustainability of the grounds that you made. And now what you've invested into your people, maybe over a year, over 6 months, or the quick wins that you got,
Sure.
those leave.
Absolutely.
And now you have to reset over again, which is the hardest thing to do, is get people to reset on something that they saw work one time, then failed, and then try to get them to restart it again, because they don't remember back here the success. They remember it failing. And so that's why you have to make sure that the processes you have in place today that are value added stay in place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're still affording, how much time do we have? Okay, so we have about 6 minutes left.
Yeah. And
It's 1:45.
Oh, okay, 15 minutes.
well, let's see if we have any more questions. And if we don't, I mean, I think we can wrap up with our first part. Any questions coming in? No? Well, thank you everyone for joining Dante and I. We really appreciate it. We'll, over the next Thursday and the following Thursday, we'll be filming part 2 and part 3. We'd love for you guys to join us as we go through our series of Panic is Not a Strategy. Thank you very much again for joining us with Powers. And if you have an opportunity, please go see us on YouTube, where Dante has a great video series on powering your culture and leadership initiatives there. And I have my own series, which is called Powering Your Productivity. And that really gets into the technical, tactical basis of how you install management operating systems. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can see some of the programs that we've been rolling out to help our clients that they've adopted, that we've been rolling out, such things as productivity sprints. We've been putting in sustainability platforms, rapid restarts. How do you restart plants effectively as you come out of the virus? That way you can get back up to your productivity numbers when all this blows over. So thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Talk to you next time. Thank you.